The more we search for ourselves, the less likely we are to find ourselves. And the more we search for God and to serve our fellow men, the more profoundly we will become acquainted with ourselves and the more inwardly assured. This is one of the great spiritual laws of life. Shoghi Effendi.
So let me begin by describing a little bit about Baha'i teachings, the Baha'i faith, for those who aren't familiar. And I also, throughout my talk, I'm going to be sharing quotes from the Baha'i writings. So this isn't all you're going to hear of Baha'i writings, or Baha'i related. The one that was so exciting to me to learn about when I first heard of the faith was the idea of progressive revelation, which is a big eye opener. And what that means is that manifestations or messengers from God appear throughout history to educate humanity about our spirit, ourself, and how we should live our lives. So they're all connected, they're all related, they're all united, but each time one appears, which is every 500 to 1,000 years, they bring new teachings that are appropriate for that time and place. The most recent manifestation is Baha'u'llah. Actually, there were two. Don't want to confuse you too much, but the Bab, who was the forerunner of Baha'u'llah, was also a manifestation, but his time period, his dispensation was very brief. Basically, he's paving the way for Baha'u'llah. And Baha'u'llah brought messages for the entire planet. So this is the first time that a messenger from God has given teachings to organize the entire planet and to give us the appropriate lessons or teachings that we need to follow in order to make this work. So the other thing that's pretty unique to the Baha'i faith is the covenant, the strength of the covenant. If you remember in the Bible and the Quran, I'm sure it talks about Noah. The story of Noah is one that the covenant is explicit, and where we learn that God promised never to leave humanity alone without his guidance, without his support. And in the Bible story, the rainbow is the sign of the covenant. So when I learned about the covenant, I thought, well, I remember that from Sunday school. So Baha'u'llah appointed his oldest son, Abdu'l-Baha, which means the servant of Baha, the servant of God, to be the only interpreter of his writings. And there are many writings. We hear there are 100 volumes, and I think that means 100 books the size of the Quran. And many are not translated. They were originally in Persian and Arabic. Abdu'l-Baha then, after the passing of Baha'u'llah, he became the sole interpreter. He made he traveled after he got out of prison. Baha'u'llah was exiled and imprisoned in what is now Israel. And when Abdu'l-Baha was finally freed from prison, he traveled to Europe and the United States, bringing the message of Baha'u'llah. At the passing of Abdu'l-Baha, he appointed his son to be the guardian. His grandson, Shoghi Effendi, to be the guardian, whose task was then to not interpret, but to create a structure that Baha'u'llah had left. He left the blueprint for this structure of how the world would be organized under the teachings of Baha'u'llah, which basically, the most unique thing is probably the abolition of clergy. And so that the Baha'i faith is essentially grassroots, which is why you don't see, unless, depending on the size of the community, you're not going to see Baha'i churches or temples in every city. And within the organization, the administrative order, which Shoghi Effendi describes as a channel for the spirit. We're not to make the administrative order be the point. It isn't the point, but it's the channel for the spirit. And it starts I mentioned at the local level, where when there are 9 or more Baha'is, they elect an assembly a local assembly. And when there are enough local assemblies in a country, they elect a national assembly. And Shoyi Effendi worked hard to make that happen by sending pioneers throughout the world. And pioneers are, Peimani mentioned that I had been a pioneer, and that was during the first 9-year plan, where I went to Italy. That was the first Universal House of Justice. So when there were enough national assemblies, they came together and elected the Universal House of Justice, which is now our point of reference for the whole world. And they still have plans for us to enact and put into practice. So there's other unique things about the teachings of Baha'u'llah. What I'm going to do is, since my talk is focused on knowing yourself, I'm going to focus a lot on those teachings. And I have a number of quotes here that I find fascinating. It's one of my favorite topics. So the thing about Baha'u'llah's writings is that they're so vast and there's so many that when we study Baha'i writings, we call it deepening, because the more you get into the teachings, the more you realize that you don't know, and you have to keep digging, and you can't just take one sentence and say, well, now I get it, I don't have to read anymore. No, you have to, for your entire life, you have to pray and meditate. We have an obligatory prayer, daily obligatory prayer. We have 3 choices. And we are also supposed to read the writings morning and evening and meditate on them. So in my 52 years as a Baha'i, I've done a lot of that, and I'm drawing from some of that, but I'm not saying that I am not the end all. There is no, as I said, the only interpreter was Abdul Baha, and I've studied his writings, Baha'u'llah's writings, messages from the Guardian, letters from the House of Justice, and still, I'm sure people will not agree with everything I'm saying. So with that note, now that's a caveat. Don't have to believe me, see for yourself. Now, the one thing about the manifestations is they've always educated humans. And there's a wonderful quote in Gems of Divine Mysteries, paragraph 17, were it not for those effulgent lights that shine above the horizon of his essence, the people would not know their left hand from their right. How much less could they scale the heights of the inner realities or probe the depths of their subtleties? So in other words, if manifestations taught us left from right, they're different, they're faith, they look the same, but they're not. Surely they taught us many other basic things. Don't need to elaborate too much on that. I don't know what they would have been, but all the things, they taught us to stand upright probably, and that kind of thing. So as humanity has matured, we've also gained capacity for complex thought. One example, and this is interesting, is I didn't realize that I used to hear it in church, know thyself. In fact, my mother would say it all the time, know thyself. And I thought, well, that must have been Jesus. But what I found was that it was inscribed on an ancient Greek temple of Apollo, probably from a manifestation. And what Baha'u'llah said 5,000 years later, he hath known God who hath known himself. That's from a book called Gleanings, page 178. Also, in Words of Wisdom, in Tablets of Baha'u'llah, true loss is for him whose days have been spent in utter ignorance of his self. So Baha'u'llah has provided a wealth of guidance about spirit, soul, and mind. And these things have never really been divided. We've talked much about soul and mind, but spirit often isn't included in the conversation. And when you start getting into those, finding teachings about that, it gets really interesting. And I'm sharing a bit of what I understand when I put all of the teachings that I found, when I put them together. So I'm basing my discussion on his teachings, and plus, I want to explore 2 sources of messages that we receive in our daily lives, not always aware of, from the spirit, from our internal spirit, which I understand is our conscience, but also from outside, sources we may not realize, especially collective thought. We realize when our parents and our teachers and our friends and the media are telling us, this is what's true, this is what you should think. We realize that, but some may be more subtle. All right, so inside, a few more teachings from Baha'u'llah about what is the nature of ourself. And it's interesting, Peimani mentioned that I had taught, and my students would often say, intercultural communication is a social science, of course, and they would also say, well, people are basically, liars, and people are human beings are basically this and that. And I would challenge them and say, go find me a social science study that tells you what is the nature of humans. Like, that we don't know from a social science perspective. We know what people do culturally, but we don't know human nature. So we have to go to Baha'u'llah and find out. And Baha'u'llah says, regard man as a mine rich in gems. Okay, so we're not born blank. We're not born, if you remember Skinner, the guy that, behavior scientist that raised a child in a crib, and, it was all stimulus response, because he said, well, you're blank, and everything humans ever know, they learn from stimulus and response. Instead, Baha'u'llah says, noble have I created thee, yet thou hast abased thyself. Rise then unto that for which thou was created. Which is contrary to what, the whole story of Adam and Eve, where, Eve tempted him. And so, humans are basically evil, and they need to be saved, etc., and all that. But in other words, the Baha'i teachings say, no, we're basically good. And we need to dig into ourselves and find who we are, how we were created, what we were created for. All right. So knowing who we are is basic to everything we do. And I want to also share a few experiences, my own personal experiences in thinking about this. Peimani also said that, suggested that I wrote this novel, which, yes, the protagonist, you're seeing through her perspective, how she's coming to understand herself. So when I was a kid, as I said, I was in Christian Sunday school, and I liked it. Nobody could understand that, but I liked it. And when I was old enough, I started listening to sermons. In fact, I memorized dozens of Bible quotes. And I wish one day I got mad at the church when I quit. I got mad at the church and threw all my ribbons away, which I wish I hadn't, because now I can't remember what I had remembered. I have to go back and read the whole Bible, figure that out. So I attended, and this is in the 60s, started listening to sermons. And in the 60s, we had a very interesting minister who used Bible to criticize war and racism, which was very unusual. In fact, for that congregation, it was too unusual. And my hometown happens to be in Wilmette, Illinois, which is where the only Baha'i temple is in North America. This minister took us around to all the different churches. We had synagogue, Catholic church, where I saw the first crucifix for the first time. And we even went to a Mormon church, not a temple, but a church. And he took us to the Baha'i temple, and I think it was the first time I went in there. We'd played around in the gardens and stuff before that, but that was before they had a whole lot of, I'd never met a live Baha'i. I'd never met a Baha'i in person. I met one nice elderly guide once. So with my minister, I'd read all the quotes on the outside and on the inside, and I really liked them. They're sort of like the quotes I read you earlier. They're short, terse, and just very intriguing. So the thing about my minister, and I said he was preaching against racism. He was starting to integrate this church in Wilmette, which is a white suburb of Chicago, and it was alienating most of the white members. And they took a vote of confidence, and he barely passed, but he left. And when he left, I left, because I figured, okay, they're all hypocrites. Because I had learned about Martin Luther King, and he'd actually marched with King, and and he brought us all, after the assassination of Dr. King, he brought us together and talked to us about what that meant also. But anyway, I left the church, and I told myself I was an atheist because I'd left the church. Anyway, like other locals in Wilmette, I appreciated the beauty of the temple, Baha'i temple. I knew nothing about it. But I went away to college and was back, freshman year, came back for the summer break. And as I said, I thought I was an atheist. So I was, and I had been involved in politics. So when I was in Boston, we're demonstrating against the war, we're demonstrating for civil rights. And I realized that the people doing this were also hypocrites, because they were asking the girls to go make them lunch. They want to change the world, and they want you to make lunch for them. So I thought, well, that's not going anywhere. And I was really searching at this point. I thought, well, a church doesn't have answers. Politics doesn't have answers. And that summer, there was, and I noticed that in Wilmette, they were going to have Seals and Crofts, who was a duo. And I had actually seen them in Boston, never heard of them before. They were then acoustic, and later they weren't, they became electronic. But I went to see James Taylor, and they were the opening. He was a folk singer, and they were opening number for James Taylor. And they sang a little song. It was, it was a goofy little song, but they mentioned Wilmette. And I turned to my friend. I said, "Nobody knows anything about Wilmette, Illinois. What are they? Who are these guys?" And so I'm home in Wilmette, and there's a concert going on. There was an ad, and I followed the ad. It was going to be outdoors and raining, so they moved it to a junior high school. And this is the first time in my life I'd ever seen Baha'i young people, for one thing, or any Baha'i, and except for that one nice woman in the bookstore. They were joyful, and they were diverse. It was wild how different they were from, I wasn't like all, back then there was, the hippies, like the real hippies, and the very conservative dressed people. But here there was not only this guy that I'd known in high school, who was a heavy beer drinker. He's there up on the stage with my mother's bridge friend, Arlene, and they're hugging each other and holding hands. I thought, man, this is powerful. The spirit is just powerful, that would unite, have people like that, best friends. And that same evening, I learned some of the teachings. Baha'i scripture was passed around. And the evidence of the spirit in that room, and seeing how it could unite these two diverse people, and the writings that I read, made me begin to reorder my own thinking. And I immediately became a Baha'i. I signed up. In fact, Arlene, who was happened to be on the local assembly, she actually called me up and she said, "Do you know what you just signed?" I said, yeah, I understand. Anyway, so it was a huge disordering in who I thought I was, what I thought I was about. Here I was this political person, marching, radical or whatever. And now I'm in a religion. I'm in a religion that, has some rules that you need to follow. And I understood what they were. And so I had been dissatisfied with my college, and I was going to study. I was changing my plan, but instead I ended up, as Paimani said in the beginning, I ended up becoming a pioneer. I worked briefly at the Baha'i National Center. And then 6 months later, I went as a pioneer to Italy. And I'd studied Italian. I was thinking I'd be a French major. And for me, languages were always pretty easy. They came easily. I was pretty fluent in French, and I learned Italian through French. I studied it before I went. And so I could communicate, I could speak pretty well. But what was interesting was that the ideas of people and their ideas of health, of humor, of propriety, of values were confusing. And the thing is, living in Chicago, I'd known people of Italian descent. In fact, one of my good friends' family was Italian, her parents spoke Italian. But what I found in living in another place, like being removed from my place into something else, was disorienting. In fact, even our ideas of America, what's America? And I'm thinking, America is, it's the center of the universe, basically. And the Italian said, no, really, it's Italy, but they argued about whether it was Rome or Naples. Milan didn't count because that came, that was sort of a new culture. But anyway, so I started thinking, I had a lot of time to pray and meditate. And I imagine, okay, what if I were born or left on a desert island as an infant and I'm alone there? How would I know who I am? How would I know what my qualities were? Because I wouldn't know if I'm being kind or generous or honest, because there's nobody to share with. There's nobody to talk to. But as I was meditating about this, I thought, but my inner self is the same person. I know inside that conscience, that voice that's speaking to me all the time. And something like American or any other label is like wearing clothes over my inner spirit, my true self. So I had to rectify the social me, the young white American woman with a certain identity, that person versus the true me, which is my inner spirit. And I'm going to share with you some quotes that guided my exploration. This is from The Hidden Words, which is a wonderful little book of gem-like writings. Baha'u'llah says, "Forget all save me and commune with my spirit. This is of the essence of my command, therefore turn unto it." So when you're meditating, you focus on God and try to, get on that wavelength, if I can call it that. Abdu'l-Bahá's talks, as I said, he's the interpreter. His talks and tablets illuminate these subjects. Because understanding what Baha'u'llah says about our spiritual reality is a vast topic. And maybe it'll take eternity to really understand it. So here's what Abdu'l-Bahá says in, the source that I found is Bahá'í scripture, so I can't give you, but if you Google it, you'll find it. "These triune powers which exist in mankind are spirit, mind, and soul. The spirit is the power of life. The mind is the power which apprehendeth the reality of things, and the soul is an intermediary between the supreme concourse and the lower concourse." So think of the supreme concourse as the spiritual world, the lower concourse is the material world. So we can turn to either one. We can turn to the supreme concourse, we can turn to God for guidance, or we can turn to the world for guidance. The world of matter, which is symbolized by darkness in holy writings. It's true in the Bible, it's true throughout. Or to God, which is symbolized by light. Another quote of Abdu'l-Bahá in Divine Philosophy, page 120 and 121. "If the soul becomes a recipient of the graces of the world of mind, its darkness will be transformed into light, its tyranny into justice, its ignorance into wisdom, its aggression into loving kindness, until it reach the apex." And he uses the word mind in here. So the soul becomes the recipient of the graces of the world of mind. The mind, according also to the same, just beyond this passage, the mind is to investigate reality. So there are all these things, and Baha'u'llah has told us we'll never figure it out. But it's, might as well give it a try. Okay, spirit, the third power, this is Abdu'l-Bahá again, same passage. This third power is the spirit, which is an emanation from the divine bestower. It is the effulgence of the sun of reality, the radiation of the celestial world, the spirit of faith. The spirit, His Holiness the Christ refers to when he says, "Those that are born of the flesh are flesh, and those that are born of the spirit are spirit." The spirit is the axis round which the eternal life revolves. It is conducive to everlasting glory and is the cause of the exaltation of humanity. So the spirit is that internal voice that knows right from wrong. It's our conscience. It's that one that's been with you since you were a kid. Then there's the Holy Spirit, which in Paris Talks is listed as the 11th principle. It's one of the basic principles of the faith. Abdu'l-Baha says, by the power of the Holy Spirit working through his soul, man is able to perceive the divine reality of things. And of course, we turn to God for assistance through prayer and meditation. And oftentimes there are these frustrating passages that where Abdu'l-Baha says, pray about it, it'll come to you, but he doesn't give the answer. So you have to really see for yourself. So bringing together so far what I've been presenting here, we're not born a blank slate. We have an innermost spirit containing the blueprints of our true self. The soul is our conscious pilot that consults with our spirit, which we call our conscience. Baha'u'llah teaches that the soul is born at conception. So the soul is born, and I get the idea that the spirit is there because we're already alive. You're already alive. Life life is there. So where does life come from? Who knows? I guess spirit. Anyway, when I became a Baha'i, when I encountered Baha'i teachings, I had a real conversion. I had an aha moment, a born again, if you want to call it that, where I had a sudden dramatic conversion where reality suddenly shifted. Everything for me became richer, deeper, and better. I recognized that my inner self was obviously different from my persona. The person I was, whatever it was, I always think of myself as, no, I know I was different then. I was a little, I was rebellious. I was probably annoying to a lot of people, etc. I had to reconcile my new born again self with my self-concept. And my friends really didn't understand it. They knew there was something different about me, and they just thought it was something really annoying. They didn't want to hear about Baha'i teachings or anything. When I declared as a Baha'i, I hadn't known about the Baha'i laws against premarital sex, drugs, or alcohol, which I had indulged in and fortuitously had banished before that spring. But also seeing as we're spiritual, not material, there's even more to think about. For instance, in the Revelation, the more we learn, the more we know. The more we know there is to learn. Here's a couple other, let's see. Okay, I'm going to move into sort of what I want to call them not outside the Baha'i faith ideas, but it's still connected to all these things I'm talking about. So the reality of man is his thought, not his material body, Abdu'l-Baha says in Paris Talks. Our reality is our thought, which also, we only have a hint of that in the Bible. And when Jimmy Carter brought that up during the election, what was it, 1979, everybody made fun of him because he was saying something in an interview that, if you've already committed adultery, if you've done it in your heart. So we have two different kinds of thought. As we said, we've got that rooted in spiritual reality. And if you've ever taken yoga, then you know about the fleeting mindless chatter that you're supposed to still, or even if you haven't, you might have noticed it. There's fleeting mindless chatter running through your head. Baha'u'llah uses the word a lot, the terms idle fancies and vain imaginings, which when you read them in context, you can think about these are those ideas that circulate through human consciousness, what society says. And it's what society says always annoyed me as a kid because, my dad would tell me, well, you got to do this because society says so. And I'm like, who are they? Like, who are these people? Putting these, making these pronouncements. So Abdu'l-Baha says, all the people have formed a God in the world of thought and that form of their own imagination they worship, when the fact is that the imagined form is finite and the human mind is infinite. So that mostly mindless chatter, it's interesting because there's several terms in the social sciences that refer to that idea of the collective consciousness, what society says. You can even just think of popular opinion. You can think of peer pressure, hegemony, which is, the values of the dominant class are internalized by, everybody else, and we're basically living according to their values. Also, you can think of collective consciousness as Satan, that Satan is really a personification of all those collective thoughts. Think about how, for instance, what are some thoughts going on or ideas circulating now? I don't want to get too inflammatory, but okay, simple ones like what do you call it? An effective life, a successful life is amassing a great fortune, having a big house, having a lot of money, having a lot of power. That's a successful life. That's in the human consciousness. If you haven't done, if you're not famous by the time you're 30, then you're a failure. Ideas like that. Let's see. Okay. And besides collective consciousness, there are some techniques in communication that we use. Peimani mentioned my dissertation about how Baha'is create unity out of diversity. And when I wrote that, when I did research for that dissertation, it was late 90s, I couldn't find articles about unity and diversity in the social science research. The social science research focused pretty much entirely on ideas of perceived similarity, that if you grow up, if you look like somebody, then you are like them. Think back to your neighborhood, everybody might be the same color, the same social class, the same values, you speak the same. But if you think of yourself, maybe if you move away and go somewhere else and, you've done a lot of other things, you find that you're way different from that. You're not like them. You're not similar anymore. And even when you were similar, you really weren't similar because that's just, you perceive it. Identification, people who identify with their culture, identify with a cuisine. I heard somebody on the radio talking about her food identity, which was her cuisine identity. And if people used her cuisine themselves, then that was a violation of, it was violating her cultural identity. You could, and when you really think about it, there's pros and cons of that, but there are limits. And then there's a theory called the social construction of reality, which is that in communication with each other, we construct a reality. And that goes very much along with this idea of the collective consciousness, that the ideas that circulate, we perceive as reality. And if you move to another country, you find that's true. You find that the things that you thought were real and true and important, they don't care about. So, you have to wonder why, and then you either have to adapt, or you can be an outsider, or you can do both. You can become sort of bilingual in culture, bicultural. Abdu'l-Baha says, God has created in man the power of reason, whereby man is enabled to investigate reality. God has not intended man to imitate blindly his fathers and ancestors. And again, Baha'u'llah also used that term of blind imitation over and over again. So we combine all these messages from culture, family, friends, institutions, media, into a collective consciousness, which Baha'u'llah refers to. He refers to humanity as dwellers in the kingdom of names and attributes. And I understand what is that. He says, warns us not to become bond slaves of this kingdom of names and attributes. So in in terms of my studies in intercultural communication, I did a lot of studying of culture and its influence on sense of self. And I would have to say that in social science terms, a culture is a kingdom of names. In fact, there's a wonderful definition of culture as a universe of shared meaning. Everything with, it's like if you read a French dictionary, everything in the dictionary is French. If you're in France, everything is French. If you're in the United States, everything here is according to the collective beliefs, the USA dictionary. So the shared cultural ideas, practices, experiences, beliefs, norms, attitudes, and histories of the place guide our behaviors. So for example, what if friends from another culture come and visit you and they want to see your culture? You know, like a lot of people just off the top of their head answering, oh, I take them to a baseball game, I take them to a football game, I take them to a burger joint. Well, those are things, but your culture is in your head. We have a mental construct of attitudes, history, shared worldview, and everything. That universe of shared meaning we carry with us. It isn't out there. It's really in our head. And how this pertains to the Baha'i faith is when, because remember, I became a Baha'i at 19, and my youngest kid was in high school when I got my PhD. So that's, I can't do the math. It's many years. It's 40 or 50, however many years since I became a Baha'i till when I'm studying. So I'm always looking at research through the lens of my understanding what Baha'u'llah says. And now I lost my train of thought of where I was going with that. But shoot, that was a good one too. Your culture. So, that when a manifestation comes, and think about the world today, or think about when Jesus came, or what Muhammad brought, culture changes. It took a while for Islam to affect the Renaissance in Europe, but Islam is really the means or the vehicle that brought all this flourishing. And I mean, they brought science to Europe. There was a Baha'i I knew who was on the House of Justice, Douglas Martin, who gave a talk once, and he said, the dumb Europeans kicked him out because he brought them baths. Islam brought baths and lights to Europe, and they'd rather have no baths, so they chased him out. Which is just a funny example, but the idea was it was foreign, it was different, they didn't like it. So anyway, following your culture is the wrong way to go. What Abdul Baha says, they have deluded themselves with a fable, and to indulge their appetites, they have done away with their own selves. They gave up everlasting glory in exchange for human pride, and they sacrificed greatness in both worlds to the demands of the insistent self. Here, I'll give you another. This is a definition of communication I came up with, and this is after studying communication since bachelor, all through. Mutual meaning making. It isn't that we're sending a message and you're receiving it, which is, radio signals. We're not doing that. We don't make meaning alone. And meaning isn't just in our words and gestures. It's in everything we do. And we're doing it together. And we live in a symbol system of meaning, which the manifestations change. For instance, Baha'u'llah brought teachings about the equality of women and men, the uniting of the human race, the oneness of humanity. Those ideas now, Baha'u'llah, the manifestations instill spirit into creation. So, that means soil, plants, animals, and all humans, not just people that read the writings. So those ideas are there in maybe in our subconsciousness, in our spiritual awareness. Today, all the peoples of the material side of wealth, all the peoples of the world are indulging in self-interest and exert the utmost effort and endeavor to promote their own material interests. They are worshiping themselves and not the divine reality, nor the world of mankind. They seek diligently their own benefit and not the commonweal. This is because they are captives of the world of nature and unaware of the divine teachings, the bounty of the kingdom, and the Son of Truth. Baha'u'llah says in Gleanings, arise, O people, and by the power of God's might, resolve to gain the victory over your own selves, that haply the whole earth may be freed and sanctified from its servitude to the gods of its idle fancies. So we form a sense of self and worldviews by having been born into a cultural world with particular perspective, filtered through a particular language, learning from family, friends, schools, media, etc., shared history and cultural values, which we often accept as facts. And what the teachings, what the writings are telling us, that's not where you get the information. So the construct of identity, which is really big these days, can be problematic. Oh, I know, I was starting to say this. When I was looking into unity and diversity, or unity, I found a lot of research on identity. And what I learned from interviewing Baha'is was how they're able to create. It's actually probably, I don't know of any other studies that did this, so maybe mine was the first, and hopefully people will read it. That showed how diverse people, I mean, I interviewed people who had been Black Muslims or militant and Black nationalists, and then also people whose families were in the Ku Klux Klan. They were living within the Mid-Atlantic area, and all were Baha'is. And they talked about how they did that, which to me, in my published article, I kind of equate it with consultation, the way it worked, but I don't need to get too much into that unless you ask me questions about it. So there's this idea, and it, of us. If there's us, there's a them, and that's othering. And there's a lot of that going on now. And it's usually in slogans like, those people, we don't agree with them because they think this and we think that. And people use the term identity to describe themselves as if there's no question such a thing exists. So it's been reified. That's a social science term for taking a thing and treating it like it's an episode or a thought and making it into a reality. Plus, okay, identity is one thing. We classify ourselves. We define ourselves as identify with my family. There's identity and identify, and they're both used in the same sentence, and they both mean different things. So your identity, well, either one, you're not a unique individual. You're identifying with a group. Your identity is in this culture, but both aren't you. That's from outside of you. But now Abdu'l-Baha says he calls them collective centers. He says those are conducive to association and unity between the children of men. But so for instance, nationalism, what does he say? Patriotism, nationalism, identity of interest, political alliance, and so on. They're helpful, but the prosperity of the world of humanity is dependent upon the organization and promotion of the collective centers. Those are accidental and not eternal, temporary and not everlasting. So in other words, those things help in organizing nations, governments, etc., but they're only temporary. They're not everlasting. So identification is affinity with a group. Identity is distinctiveness of self. And another thing is that culture, like language, evolves with our personal and collective experience. And that was another thing I wanted to impress on my students, is that we are all creating culture. It's not a thing out there. If it's a universe of shared meaning, we're constantly creating it. And that was an idea that they usually couldn't accept. So we had a lot of talks about that. So how do you deal with all of this? And I think there are internal and external strategies. So thinking about the world, we have to always increase awareness of cultural assumptions. As a Baha'i, I lived in a community that was mostly Persian, and we had different cultural assumptions in our community. And, you know, I don't know that all Persians do that, but in this community, all Persians wanted to do a certain thing a certain way, and the Americans did it, you know, a different way. And usually they weren't discussed because nobody noticed what exactly is going on. So you really have to pay attention, be aware, and be aware that other people have a culture. You have a culture, yeah, but so does everybody. And then that leads to abandoning prejudices. Abdu'l-Baha says racial assumption and distinction are nothing but superstition. So that we are a certain way because we are of a race or anything is a superstition. Prejudices, I think pretty much everybody knows what prejudices are. And again, going back to seeing with your own eyes, hearing with your own ears, doing your independent investigation of truth. Abdu'l-Baha says the root cause of prejudice is blind imitation in religion, in racial attitudes, in national bias in politics. By this division and separation into groups and branches of mankind, prejudice is engendered, which becomes a fruitful source of war and strife. Boundaries are imaginary. In promulgation of universal peace, God created all the continents without national divisions. These are but imaginary lines and boundaries. Okay, so internal strategies. How do we deal with this internally? And this goes back to prayer and meditation. Silence the mental engine of your soul, commune with your spirit, basically. The soul is like a library, a resource of past decisions and knowledge for your spirit. So as you move through culture, you're always making choices. That's the thing. We always are deciding. We're creating our destiny. We're deciding to identify with this or that, to accept this or that idea, to live in this or that way. And again, the closer you're living to what Baha'u'llah says or what any manifestation says, the better off you're going to be, the straighter path you're going to be on. So we need to detach from, investigate and question the shallow, the material, the popular, and the inherited ideas. Everything. You have to really examine everything. Baha'u'llah says all that which you potentially possess can, however, be manifested only as a result of your own volition. I'll just read these final two quotes and give you my 5-line conclusion. Baha'u'llah, Arabic Hidden Words, number 19. I have breathed within thee a breath of my own spirit, that thou mayst be my lover. Why hast thou forsaken me and sought a beloved other than me? And from Persian Hidden Words 12, close one eye and open the other. Close one to the world and all that is therein, and open the other to the hallowed beauty of the beloved. So deepen on the writings or deepen on whatever scripture you have. Pray, meditate, commune with your spirit. See with your own eyes, hear with your own ears. Detach from your material self. You know, what sex you are, your position in life, how much money you have. Focusing on developing a true self, a spiritual self, and also seeing others, everybody else as a thinking, feeling, spiritual being. And that is it. That's it. It's not simple, and it isn't easy.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vance. We really appreciate you giving us all of your insight and background on this topic. And I know it was very enjoyable and everyone enjoyed your talk today. If you have any questions, you can put it in the chat now and I'll read them out loud. So our first question is, how might a common language lead to a global culture, but not erase local or national cultures?
Wow. That's a challenge, isn't it? You know, I would think that the sooner an auxiliary language came into being, the longer we'd have to incorporate some of those cultural, a collective cultural experience. And perhaps over time that'll lead to a universal language that reflects meanings that exist only in certain places or used to exist only in certain places. Perhaps we'll adopt those ways of seeing things. You know, our mind is bigger than we know. And so we have capacity. I don't think it can, you know, I think the de facto one at the moment that's spoken all over the world is English. I don't think that was the plan, but that's what's happening because of business. And you can see that, for instance, in English, people are making up their own words and applying their own native tongues to some meanings. But other than that, I know this, I'm just conjecturing.
Thank you. Okay, while we're waiting for more questions, I had a question. You were talking about, like culture, and I was wondering, in terms of finding our true self, our spiritual, like you said, we're not a blank slate, and we come with, spiritual qualities into this world. How do we differentiate between our true self, like as we enter this world, and our self as conditioned by our culture or our society that we live in?
Yeah, well, that's difficult, especially if you're born into a family that isn't thinking that way. I think if you were as an infant born into a family that could help you find your true self, it probably wouldn't be as hard. Yeah, that's the task. I think, a lot of meditating, a lot of praying, and then a lot of just examining, reading the writings and examining through that lens, and deepening with the writings if you can, conversing about in a deep way with other people, not just reading on the surface and think, okay, I know that. You think you know it because the writings seem so, when I first started reading them, they just seem so obvious. Oh, well, that's obvious. But then when you really think deeply about some of these things, you find that there is way more. There's way more in there. So I may be missing the gist of that question, but that's how I recall it.
Thank you. The next question is, do you find that sincere people of many faiths, such as in interfaith activities, demonstrate the validity of their beliefs?
The sincerity, yes, absolutely. I think sincerity for any of us, and by sincere, and remember, what was the quote about Abdu'l-Baha that Baha'u'llah said he was the only person who was integrated inside and out. His inner being and his outer being were one and the same. I mean, that's the definition of sincerity, is that everything we think, we wouldn't care if it were broadcast because our thoughts are pure. Now, I don't know if there is anybody like that, but I think a very sincere person would be actually behaving in the way they're thinking and speaking. In fact, it's I love that question because I'm involved. We're involved here in Cincinnati, a very strong interfaith group, such as I've never seen before. And the Zoroastrian friend of mine, talks about it's right. What is it? Right thought, right word, right deed. And Zoroastrianism is like what, 3,000 years old, and that's a basic teaching that all of us should, all humanity should have learned as new teachings were brought. That's a pretty fundamental one. And it's cool going back to some of the ancient Hindu beliefs and so on, and seeing those are really the core things we should have been building on as a human race, rather than consistently rejecting the manifestations when they bring their message. That in itself is something to think about. What is it about human beings that consistently reject these beings that come with spiritual guidance, who don't want anything for, Baha'u'llah gave up his wealth. He owned, his family owned towns. He lived in splendor. But he's called by God to present this, and he does. He loses everything. They're walking in the snow with just no boots or anything, nothing against the cold, and end up in prison and throughout the empire, the Ottoman Empire. They end up in Palestine. Baha'u'llah's in jail for a few months, and in jail in the city for the next 40 years. But, he did that. He didn't have to do that. He could say, okay, God, he probably couldn't. I don't know if you can disobey God on that level. I think he was constrained, but probably, who knows a manifestation. They are not like us. I don't know if that answered the question, but.
Thank you. Have interfaith activities changed your view of religion?
I don't know. Maybe they've changed my view of people of faith. because I hadn't, we lived in another city, and I was on the board of Interfaith Hospitality Network, where it seemed, people of other religions there were more interested in converting each other. They really didn't want to listen to you. They wanted to tell you what reality is. And but we did manage to create a good interfaith hospitality network. It's a great function. So in being in a city where there's a very strong interfaith community is one where there isn't that sort of proselytizing. We're accepting, hey, we know we disagree on basic things. Christians don't want to be Baha'i. They have their community, they have their traditions. And Muslims don't think there's going to be many. A couple of them, one imam keeps saying that. He used to anyway. He quit doing it, but he would say, he kept saying Muhammad is the last prophet. Well, we smile and say, okay, but didn't argue. But especially some of the older ones, Hindus and Zoroastrians, they're some of the most spiritual people I've ever met. So many Christians. And when I read, I read things on Facebook and hear people say, well, all Christians are, they're creating all this turmoil and all that. Well, no, they're not. That's another prejudice. That's another generalization. There are many people of faith who are out in the world, toiling in the vineyard, doing good deeds and good works. And all of us of every faith, we all need to respect that of each other and not expect people to suddenly agree with you. And the only way I think that any people of any faith can show you that their religion has meaning is through their deeds and their words and their friendship. And I can't say enough good things about the interfaith group here. It goes way back. It's got a cool beginning. I've written about it in Baha'i Teachings. What is it, .org? BahaiTeachings.org. I give some stories about some of the interfaith things we've done. So no, I don't think, because once I became Baha'i, I understood that it's all one. I didn't know anything about Islam, but I've studied the Quran to a certain extent, and you should, if you read the Kitab Yagan, the Book of Certitude, you should study the Quran, and I studied it last year with a Baha'i who'd lived in the Middle East, working for a petroleum company for, 10 or 20 years, who knew Arabic and he knew the Quran so well, and he knew the Baha'i faith so well. He was an older guy. And it was just fascinating to see. And I'll tell you a funny story. I don't think I have a brother who's also a Baha'i. He became a Baha'i. He's my older brother, but I was the first Baha'i. And our family is Christian. And one Christmas, we're at his house. His wife is Christian, and my mom and everybody. And my brother was host. He says, okay, for Christmas dinner, he says, I'm going to read from the good book. And he stands up and he reads this passage and he closes the book, and all the Christians say, oh, that's so beautiful. That's just so wonderful. And everybody leaves the room, and my brother goes to me, he says, that's from the Quran, which cracked me up. I thought that was great, because they couldn't, and he teaches, he goes around, he's a Baha'i, and he talks to Christians, and he knows ministers. He says, what about the parable of the Good Shepherd? It's in Ezekiel, it's in John. The shepherd says, Jesus says, as the shepherd, the sheep know my voice. They will know my voice. That when you hear the words of the manifestation, you recognize that same voice. And when we do our, we've had 4 festival of faiths here. And the first 2 were in person, the second 2 on Zoom, like everything. And then in the first 2, people didn't want to leave the room. They didn't want to leave the building because the spirit was so strong. And that spirit didn't come from just a few people. That was from the unity that was building in that room, in that place. We had 2,000 people the first year with no advertising. And we did this in a period of 4 months. The point I was going to make, though, was when the Baha'i, we had our own Baha'i, everybody had a different prayer session, and Baha'is had theirs. And the people at the door were Catholic, and they're, came up to me later and said, that was my favorite. That was my favorite of all the prayers, was the Baha'i session for everybody. And they thought it was weird we sat in a circle, because all the other ones, everybody, and Baha'is do that because we don't have clergy. So we sit in circles. We're not talking, listening to somebody talk. But I think experiences like that happened throughout. The Muslims taught us how to put on a hijab, and so on.
Oh, thank you so much again for your talk and giving us your time today.
Well, thank you, and your family for letting me do this. This is a lot of fun.
Of course, thank you. So next week, our speaker will be Mr. Shaheen Sobhani, and his topic will be One Common Faith. So again, these are every Saturday at 12 p.m. Eastern time, and I'll put the link to our contact form again if you'd like to be added to our mailing list. And we'll end today with a quotation by Abdul Baha, the son of Baha'u'llah, set to music.
He verily, verily hath dominion